Right, first I'm going to assume that my opinion is right. Now that removes padding, but it also obliges you to believe nothing until you trust it. I put all this in a PDF, which you'll find the address of at the end of this talk. So what's the message? Immunology is on the cusp of one of those major scientific revolutions that Thomas Kuhn talked about. Now it's not working for me here. Sorry about this. Thomas Kuhn popularized a paradigm shifts. It matters not who may have presented or propagated it, but it matters a lot to focus on it. Now, just as Copernicus challenged the perspective of an Earth-centered firmament, immunology is headed for a similar revolution. For historical reasons, the whole of the immune universe came to be constructed around lymphocytes, antibodies, and adaptive immunity. Up to the last few years, it's been considered to be a lymphocyte-centered and lymphocentric universe that revolves around bug hunting, chasing, and killing. And it also discriminates self molecules from non-self molecules in their belief. I believe the discipline has driven itself up a blind alley from which it's now hard to escape. This old perception is wrong, I think. The system instead is hell-bent on integrity and homeostasis. At its core sits inflammation. It's inflammacentric, as in heliocentric. Phagocytes are its chief executors. All else is satellite stuff that stacks up just to enhance the function and efficiency of inflammation. I've adopted the word morphostasis to describe this. Thomas Kuhn talked of tautologies, that is, situations that in retrospect should never have been seen otherwise. This highlights the problem science has with hidden assumptions. Until you see how the assumption has blinded you, you cannot shed the blinders. So for those who aren't sure what inflammation is, here's a resume. Whenever there's a disruption in the body, a stereotypical sequence begins. It starts with chemical and nerve alerting signals that advertise, we have a problem. On this cue, the local small venules undergo changes. They swell to increase blood flow. They become leaky. Polymorphonuclear phagocytes latch onto the vessel wall and then insinuate themselves between the lining endothelial cells to escape into and invade the surrounding tissues. They act like a pack of hungry wolves. They retain some sense of what a healthy tissue cell feels like and avoid too much damage to them. Everything else, cells, organisms, biological debris, etc., is a feast to be devoured. Once this wave of polymorphs has done its job, they begin to commit suicide, mulching the contents. And the next ingress of phagocytes, the macrophages, sweep in. These clear away the dying polymorphs and continue the debridement of tissue debris. Cell cells are not necessarily exempt from aggressive attention, particularly if they're subpar. As the debridement subdues, so the macrophages change the behavior from aggressive destructive to nurturing pro-regenerative, and the rebuild begins. Pain nerves become supersensitive, and any movement causes discomfort that inhibits unnecessary movement that might disrupt resolution. The macrophages now take on a commanding role in reconstruction. Now a tolerant rather than an aggressive milieu becomes important. This allows activated stem cells to go about the rebuilding without interference or suspicion. As you're aware from experience, this happens over 10 to 14 days, but it becomes increasingly prolonged and less efficient as we age. So this is the core response, and everything else is a satellite process. Adaptive immunity gives information and memory, so that it can turn on fast and caricature its response on any subsequent encounter with a similar set of circumstances. So how do we get to the point where we ignore the centrality and importance of this core process? Science tends to grow by popular modes of investigation, in particular, measurable parameters. The outcome can be, at any particular point in this process, that two things happen. First, there's an attraction towards dissective investigation. Focal things become known about in increasing detail, and investigators may become engrossed in this local scenario. This is well emphasized in Godfrey Sax's poem about the elephant and the blind man of Hindustan. Each is convinced of his own perspective that is right, and is keen to dismiss other views. but we, retrospectively, have an overview of the elephant. Second, these focused investigations distort the overall process. A nice analogy is the representation of the body on the cerebral cortex. A fully functional and well-proportioned human is hardly apparent from this cortical representation. The adaptive immune system currently enjoys an exaggeration well beyond the tongue or a fingertip on this. How did this distortion arise historically? Elon Metchnikoff is the neglected hero of immunology who gets mostly lip service. He wrote extensively about the involvement of phagocytes in response to damage and to infective invasion. In a series of lectures, The Comparative Physiology of Inflammation, back in 1893, he made startling observations. These were sidelined for over half a century and are only just re-emerging now in importance. They were ignored by a faction who believed that the serum factors were core and central in immunology. They believed that these were all that was needed to explain it. For them, Metchnikoff was misrepresenting things. Metchnikoff's realizations included a bevy of observations. Inflammation responds to everything disruptive, and that is damage, toxins, infections, and you can go on. He fully encompassed the importance of evolution and comparative approach, and in this respect foreshadowed the famous quotation that Tom has shown earlier, where nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. These phagocytic cells accumulate as the first responders to the site of disruption in set in motion debridement, reconstruction, and then restitution. For him, phagocytes and inflammation were the universe center of immune activity. He realized it had functions in development, for example, tadpole tail resorption, in the maintenance of tissue integrity, in damage management, infection control, and he even realized it may be important to debride damaged tissues to remove potential growth media for invading organisms. In 1908, the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was jointly awarded to Metchnikoff and Ehrlich, who can split the then extant factions into the cellulists, the phagocyte protagonists, and the humoralists, the complement antibody protagonists. I think Ehrlich was less condemnatory of the cellular theorists than many of his fellow humoralist protagonists. Whatever, never the two shall meet prevailed. I think the humoralists won out the next 40 years or more because it was more laboratory-based and measurable. Metchnikoff's work was interpretive. So his ideas went into eclipse and remained there until the Second World War, when Medawar, investigating burns and potential skin grafts, noticed the strong participation of cells in the rejection process. In looking for an explanation that fitted well with the humoralist views, the immunologists began to think about self-non-self discrimination. They swallowed the idea that molecules that T cells recognize are sorted one by one into self or non-self. They just learned about the one lymphocyte, one antibody idea. But studies in dizygotic calf twins show that the fetal thymus was an important organ that oversees the reactivity of lymphocytes. It averts aggressive responses to self tissues. At this point, the immune system is seen as just an aggressive system. The assumption was that self-reactive lymphocytes are cold, so self-non-self discrimination by mammalian fetus thymus became a de facto belief. This cold seems to be supported by the intense lymphocyte death that's observed in the thymus. The fulcral role of lymphocytes in the immune process became an accepted dogma. These cells were the ones that deliver aggression to pathogenic organisms, and they were also responsible for graft rejection, a clear signal that they appeared to discriminate self from non-self epitopes. This cataloguing idea is beginning to appear quaint now. Between the 1970s and into the 1990s, inflammation was regarded as a sort of parallel subplot, an also-ran event that was not intimately integrated with the adaptive immune system. The evolution of the adaptive immune system was regarded as a transitional new toy developed by evolution that gave it massive advantages in dealing with pathogens that were well beyond the capability of invertebrates. However, we now know that lymphocytes that specifically respond to microbial threats use alpha-beta receptors that recognize oligopeptides in the groove of major histocompatibility molecules, MHC molecules. These were only a subset of the retinue of lymphocyte lineages. Gamma delta T cells are common. They don't recognize MHC peptide complexes. Instead, they seem to be involved in innate protection of tissues. And then there are a host of other innate lymphocytes and natural killer cells. Something suspicious here. So let's go back to Metchnikoff's ideas on debris management and tissue debridement. This raises a window on entropy. Edwin Schrödinger famously stated that a living organism feeds upon negative entropy. Thus, the device by which an organism maintains itself stationary at a fairly high level of orderliness, fairly low level of entropy, really consists of continually sucking orderliness from its environment. Living organisms harvest energy and degrade it to less usable forms so that they can claw their way back up the maintenance of order gradient. So what is entropy? It's a pity that it started out as an apparently positive concept, whereas in fact it's sort of negative. That makes it harder to juggle in our minds. The inversion negentropy was coined to better help us to think about the availability and utility of energy gradients. Low entropy energy sources are highly focal and concentrated. Examples are the sun and a battery. And it's then relatively easy to utilize the flow of energy as an engine for various processes. As we disperse strong and focalized energy, low entropy, along a gradient, they become dispersed into progressively diffuse microstates. So it becomes harder to tap any contained energy along a usable gradient. It's really a probability thing. Isolated pockets of concentrated energy are improbable states that prefer to flow to distributed and diffuse packets of energy. The flow is an asymptote towards inevitability. Now, the movement of molecules is a nice example of microstates. The occasional individual molecule can have speeds way above the average. If we could farm this somehow, we could concentrate it up to do useful work, and that's Maxwell's famous thought experiment. But it appears that sorting needs to disperse more energy than it's able to concentrate. Otherwise, we'd have a perpetual motion machine. The idea that entropy is synonymous with disorder is popular, but whilst enemy is undoubtedly the nemesis of order, this is only because order needs maintenance and thus energy expenditure, or it will degrade and disperse. Where do living organisms dominantly get their energy to construct biomolecules? Living on Mother Earth, our chief source of local low-entropy energy is radiated at us from the sun. Ultimately, nearly all life on Earth is dependent on some organism turning this radiation into biomolecules that are then bagged up in living cells. Those that are not primary producers need to find alternative fuel to survive. Aside from the primary synthesizing providers, the largest block of living organisms rely on detritus. They're detritovores, and we are detritophile. These live and persist by managing the decay of sun-driven life that is itself a sort of halfway house of detritus and degradation. The end of the journey is the final radiation of infrared light, or infrared out into deep space. Photosynthesizers provide detritophiles with degraded molecules that can be burned, as it were. The vast majority of them are patient. They'll wait for their meals to be offered rather than killing an organism before breaking it up. The ones that don't wait we grace with the term pathogen, herbivore, carnivore. Dying animals release a bevy of come and eat me signals and surface molecules. The latter fall into the damage-associated membrane pattern molecules, DAMPs as they're called, and toll-like receptors are at least responsible for identifying some of them. Now, bacteria display membrane-associated membrane patterns and also interact with toll-like receptors. I like to think that this is a deliberate mimic to have yourself invited in during that transition from life to death. Thus, you've got a head start in the competition for resources. The sanctity of life is a peculiarity of complex social animals and reaches a zenith in socially advanced human societies. You can't wantonly throw away a lifetime of social skills and knowledge in complex societies. Sacrifice, however, is freely embraced by many simpler organisms, including our own constituent cells, and used liberally to gain advantage for their species genome. Extending Metchnikoff's ideas, we see that the inflammatory system, and now by implication all the subservient systems, are hell-bent on beating back the tide of entropy. I've adopted the term morphostasis, as I said before. All organisms are successful at this, as exemplified by the rapid disintegration after death. I'll put some videos on a bit later at the end of the course, the talk. So if our response to invading microorganisms is really an attempt to manage disruption, then we may not have a targeted attack on the pathogenic organisms themselves, but on the pathogenic signature of the debris that they are in and generate. This is a fundamental change from the deliberate bug-targeted chasing and killing immune response. They evoke responses because they are associated with detritus, not because they are microorganisms. If a phagocyte comes across them, it'll chase them, okay, but that's because it's remembering its primordial origins as a unicellular amoeboid animal. But it doesn't need to rely on the adaptive immune system for that. So what's the dominant meal for all our phagocytes? Is it bacteria? Is it traumatically dying tissues? No. Every day, it's estimated that 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000 of our own cells undergoes a controlled shutdown. This is their dominant diet by far. I'm assuming a black and white here in that we can divide death into controlled shutdown apoptosis and a catastrophic necrotic demise. But modern research has uncovered many spectral variants of this. But that simple classification will do here. The extraordinary things about apoptosis are it's massive and can reach bizarre levels, particularly in the thymus. It's what is termed silent. Phagocytes and even adjacent cells clear away debris with barely a murmur of complaint from the system. It's said that it's immunologically silent. I'm challenging that. All cell death leads to phagocyte processing and ultimately presentation to lymphocytes for memorizing. The general milieu predominating when phagocytic antigen presenting cells process the debris in which it is logged. It logs the context of how it's met this debris. On meeting a precursor T cell, there's an appropriate receptor, which is randomly generated, by the way. This cell is primed to reproduce that milieu on re-encounter. So silent apoptosis leads to the suppression of inflammation on re-encounter, and messy spilt cytoplasm leads to an intensely inflammatory response on next encounter. So die tidily and with minimal inflammation, and the next time you're encountered, you'll suppress local inflammation. Should you die messily, shedding your contents, then the next occasion you're met, you'll induce an aggressive pro-inflammatory response. Now, this sits nicely with what happens in the fetal thymus, and also with what we call peripheral tolerance. On this view, logic would suggest that the extraordinary levels of apoptosis occurring in the thymus promote tolerance to any lymphocytes that meet their respective epitopes there. The old theory says that the lymphocytes die and are excluded from the repertoire. We've only got to observe that the thymus generates copious suppressor T cells to overthrow that perspective. And as this is what transpires, it becomes increasingly clear that the thymus is a powerhouse of tolerant T cell production. Now, what happens in systemic and lupus erythematosus is that there's often an abnormality of complement in this disease. Complement's important for rendering debris tasty to phagocytes. It aids the silent clearance of apoptotic cells and their exosomes. Leave this debris around too long, and the membrane packets are just that are around begin dispersing and will start to burst and become hyperimmunogenic, leading to an aggressive T cell response on re-encounter. We're now becoming aware that aging is also associated with the progressive accumulation of apoptotic cells, and there's a progressive impairment of their efficient clearance. So I've condemned self-antigen, non-self antigen discrimination by lymphocytes to the trash can and replaced it with tidy demise, messy demise discrimination. Furthermore, the aggressive or suppressive instructions on re-encounter can change over time as new naive cells emerge from the bone marrow. It depends on the dominant context of presentation. Every day, large numbers of our cells give up the ghost tidily. That means that most epitopes associated with cells will have a dominant suppressive action attached to a T cell's antigen specific receptor when it re-encounters its respective antigen. We can easily overcome this by getting a particular tissue, like nervous tissue, for example, and repeating and injecting it along with a strongly inflammatory stimulatory cocktail. Gradually, new T cells are produced that have not yet been committed to aggression or suppression. Then we end up with an experimental allergic encephalitis. So, attacks on self are committed, but the conditions for creating them are unusual and need to be persistent. It is my belief that tuberculosis in particular deliberately provokes this sort of auto-rejection to provide itself with a suitable culture medium. At low levels, auto-rejection is probably useful for clearing pockets of disorder. All inflammation includes some level of auto-rejection. But should it get out of control, this will threaten survival, and it must be switched off locally. So a hyper-excited aggressive immune response saturates and turns into focal immunosuppression. It is this sort of environment that allows mutated cells with abnormal growth controls to grow into malignant tumours. Furthermore, the regenerative phase of inflammation requires invasive stem cells to run rampant in the local area until they reach an appropriate mass and switch off proliferation, what's called so-called contact inhibition phenomena. Oncogenes are disruptions of this normal switch-off mechanism. There would be no great problem if it were not for the local immunosuppression and the simultaneous disruption around the p53 proteins that are normally sensitive to misbehaved stem cells. Healthy p53 systems can switch them into apoptosis. The focal T cell tolerance in inflammation is locally expressed and aimed at giving stem cells free rein to do their thing. The inflammatory switch off that follows destructive overzealousness starts locally but spills over systemically. TB, cancer, aging are all accompanied by this. Aging probably results in an increasing prevalence of inflammatory responses that can't close out properly and so become chronic. So is self-non-self discrimination dead? No, not at all. It's just nothing to do with thymic T cells. Every cell in the body has ways to establish who it wants to talk to and cooperate with. Cell adhesion molecules, CAMs, are all important here, and it can hardly be a surprise to find that these molecules are all important in immune cell interactions, and that the T cell receptors and antibodies are all constructed using an immunoglobulin superfamily gene that originated in CAMs. It looks as though the MHC is deliberately mixing up identities that would otherwise become a sitting duck for code-breaking microorganisms. Organ-specific identities are remarkably conserved in evolution. The addition of a peptide oligomer to the MHC molecule's groove looks like an allo-MHC specificity. That makes it harder to crack the code. But bacteria, in particular, evolve fast, and they often have as much as 90 years to play code breaking. I suspect that this will prove important in aging. Well, I've scratched the surface and given some ideas. I'll put a bit more in the web files, or at least I will do by tonight. And I'm wishing I could really see into your mind to discover what you really want to know about the immune system, but I hope I've made at least a few good guesses. In conclusion, the lymphocentric immune view of the universe is a hidden assumption, but it's plain wrong. The system is inflammacentric, and this perceptual change is little short of Copernican. So my final act is to paraphrase the original title of the talk,